Maps have always been weapons of war. But what happens when the weapon turns against you? In the spring of 1944, a single pencil stroke on a piece of paper would seal the fate of thousands of men and dozens of tanks. This is the true story of how one wrongly drawn village map trapped an entire Panzer division. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more incredible historical stories like this one. The morning of April 12, 1944, began like any other in the German High Command's mapping division, housed in a requisitioned chateau outside of Caen, France. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber sat at his drafting table, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. Around him, other cartographers worked in silence, their pens scratching across paper as they updated tactical maps based on reconnaissance reports coming in from the front. Friedrich was 28 years old, a geography teacher from Munich before the war. He had been assigned to cartography because of his poor eyesight, a detail that would prove more significant than anyone could have imagined. His wire-rimmed glasses sat crooked on his nose, one lens cracked from when he had stumbled during an air raid 2 weeks earlier. He had requested a replacement, but supplies were scarce, and optical equipment was low on the priority list. The task before him seemed simple enough. A reconnaissance team had surveyed the area around the village of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, and Friedrich needed to update the master map that would be distributed to various Wehrmacht units, including the 21st Panzer Division currently stationed 30 kilometers to the east. The reconnaissance report described a small valley with two possible routes through it, one narrow road through the village itself, and another wider path that curved around to the south. Friedrich squinted at the aerial photographs spread before him, comparing them to the handwritten notes from the reconnaissance team. The photographs were grainy, taken from a Luftwaffe plane 3 days earlier. Through his damaged glasses, the images blurred together. He rubbed his eyes, trying to focus. The problem was a simple geographic feature, a small tributary stream that fed into the larger Aure River. According to the reconnaissance notes, the stream ran north of the southern route, leaving the path clear for heavy vehicles. But as Friedrich stared at the photographs, the stream seemed to curve differently. Or did it? He couldn't be sure. The crack in his lens created a distortion that made distances difficult to judge. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, and he had been working for 16 hours straight. His commanding officer, Major Klaus Richter, had made it clear that these maps needed to be completed by morning. The 21st Panzer Division was preparing for a major repositioning, and they needed accurate terrain information. Friedrich made a decision. He would trust the photographs over the reconnaissance notes. After all, photographs didn't lie. What he didn't know was that the photographs had been taken at an unusual angle due to heavy anti-aircraft fire, creating an optical illusion about the stream's location. With careful, precise strokes, he drew the tributary running south of the road, effectively marking the southern route as impassable for heavy vehicles due to soft, waterlogged ground. He finished the map at 2 a.m, filed it with the others, and stumbled to his quarters. He never looked at it again. 6 days later, on April 18th, Hauptmann Ernst Holzer stood in the commander's hatch of his Panzer IV tank, studying the map that had been distributed to his unit. Ernst was 32, a veteran of the Eastern Front with a reputation for caution and tactical intelligence. He had survived 3 years of combat, not through recklessness, but through careful planning. The 21st Panzer Division had received orders to relocate to defensive positions closer to the coast. Allied intelligence suggested a major invasion was imminent, though no one knew exactly where or when it would come. Ernst's company, consisting of 22 tanks and approximately 200 men, was to move through the Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer area and establish positions overlooking the beaches. Ernst traced the route with his finger. The map showed two options: through the village itself, which would be slow due to the narrow medieval streets, or the southern route, which appeared wider and more suitable for armored vehicles. However, the map clearly marked the southern route as unsuitable due to marshy conditions from the tributary stream. He called over his second-in-command, Oberfeldwebel Martin Schneider, a stocky man from Bavaria, who had been with Ernst since Kursk. "What do you think, Martin? Through the village, or do we scout the southern route first?" Martin studied the map, his weathered face thoughtful. "The map says marsh, but these maps have been wrong before. Remember that bridge near Prokhorovka that was supposed to be destroyed but was actually intact?" Ernst nodded. "True, but we don't have time to scout. High Command wants us in position by tomorrow evening. The village route is certain even if it's slow." "The village it is, then," Martin agreed. They set out at dawn on April 19th. The column of tanks moved slowly through the French countryside, their tracks churning up the dirt roads. The weather was cool and overcast, typical for Normandy in spring. Ernst watched the landscape pass by, noting the ancient hedgerows that bordered every field, the thick bocage that would make defensive fighting easier but offensive movement nearly impossible. As they approached Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer around mid-morning, Ernst felt his first sense of unease. The village was larger than he had expected, with buildings crowding close on both sides of the main street. The street itself was barely wide enough for a single tank, let alone a military column. He halted the company and sent scouts ahead on foot. They returned 20 minutes later with bad news. The street narrowed even further in the center of town, and there was a sharp turn around the old church that would be extremely difficult for the tanks to navigate. Worse, local resistance activity had been reported in the area. Moving slowly through a confined space was an invitation for ambush. Ernst pulled out his map again, studying the southern route. According to the cartography, it was impassable. But what if the map was wrong? What if they could save hours by taking the wider route? He made a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. We'll try the southern route, carefully. If we encounter any problems, we back out and take the village route. Martin, take a motorcycle scout and check the first kilometer. If it looks passable, we proceed. Martin took 2 men on motorcycles and disappeared down the southern road. He returned 30 minutes later, his face optimistic. The road is solid, sir. No sign of water or soft ground. I think the map is wrong. Ernst felt a wave of relief. Excellent. We move out immediately. Pass the word. Maintain spacing, watch for soft ground, and be ready to stop on my command. The column began moving down the southern route. The road was indeed wider than the village street, bordered by tall hedgerows on both sides. The tanks moved in single file, their engines roaring, their tracks clanking against the packed earth. The spring air smelled of diesel fuel and crushed grass. For the first 2 kilometers, everything went smoothly. The road curved gently around farmland, exactly as the map indicated. Ernst began to relax. They had made the right choice. Then, around a sharp bend, everything changed. The road began to descend into a shallow valley, and suddenly the ground became softer. Not immediately impassable, but noticeably different. Ernst felt his tank settle slightly, the tracks sinking just a centimeter or 2 deeper than before. He raised his hand to signal caution, but the column was committed now. Behind him, 21 other tanks followed, along with support vehicles and trucks carrying supplies and infantry. As they descended further into the valley, Ernst saw something that made his blood run cold. Ahead, perhaps 500 meters away, the road made a sharp turn to the left, curving around what appeared to be a small hill. But between his position and that turn, the ground on both sides of the road showed clear signs of water. Not the major stream marked on his map, which was supposed to be on the other side of the road, but numerous smaller tributaries and springs that had turned the surrounding fields into marsh. The road itself was still passable, but it had become a narrow causeway between areas of soft, waterlogged ground. And ahead, at the turn, he could see where previous vehicle traffic had churned up the earth, revealing dark, muddy soil underneath. All units, reduce speed, Ernst commanded over the radio. Watch your spacing. We're on softer ground. His tank reached the turn, and he guided his driver carefully around it. The Panzer II's treads gripped the road surface, but Ernst could feel the vehicle shifting, settling, fighting for traction. They made it around, and Ernst breathed a sigh of relief. Behind him, the second tank began the turn. It was an older Panzer III, slightly lighter than Ernst's vehicle. The commander, a young lieutenant named Hans Becker, navigated the turn carefully, but as his tank's rear end swung around, the right track slipped off the edge of the road into the softer ground beyond. The tank lurched, then settled at an angle, its right side sinking into the mud. Hans tried to power out, but the spinning track only dug deeper. Within seconds, the tank was immobilized, sitting at a 45-degree angle, blocking the road completely. Ernst cursed. All units, halt. Recovery crew forward. But there was a bigger problem that Ernst was only beginning to realize. Behind Hans's stuck tank, the rest of the column had stopped, and as they sat, their combined weight began to affect the road surface. Several tanks had stopped on the softer section of road before the turn, and now, as their engines idled and their weight pressed down, they began to sink. Martin's voice came over the radio, tight with concern. Sir, we have multiple vehicles reporting traction problems. The ground is giving way. Ernst climbed out of his hatch and stood up, surveying the situation. What he saw chilled him. The entire column, stretched out over 2 kilometers, was trapped on a narrow causeway surrounded by marsh. The tanks couldn't turn around because the road was too narrow and the ground too soft. They couldn't move forward because of the stuck tank blocking the way. And they couldn't move backward without risking more vehicles becoming stuck on the compromised road surface. They were trapped. The recovery effort began immediately. Crews attached tow cables to Hans's tank, attempting to pull it back onto the road. But in the soft ground, the recovery vehicles couldn't get proper purchase. Their own tracks began to sink as they strained against the weight of the stuck Panzer III. Hours passed. The overcast sky began to spit rain, light at first, then heavier. The moisture made the situation worse, softening the ground further. By mid-afternoon, 3 tanks were completely stuck, and 5 others were showing signs of sinking. The infantry had dismounted and were standing uselessly in the fields, watching their armored support become progressively more immobilized. Ernst radioed headquarters explaining the situation. The response was not sympathetic. "You were ordered to use the village route. Why did you deviate from orders?" The map indicated the southern route was impassable due to marshy conditions south of the road, Ernst explained, trying to keep his voice steady. But the actual marsh is on both sides of the road, and the road itself is passable only in dry conditions. The map was wrong. There was a long pause. The maps were prepared by qualified cartographers using aerial reconnaissance. Are you suggesting our intelligence is faulty? I'm suggesting that this particular map contains an error, sir. The tributary stream is not where it's marked. Another pause. Your orders stand. Get your unit moving and reach your designated position. We have no assets to spare for recovery operations. You'll have to manage with what you have. The radio went dead. Ernst stood in the rain, feeling the weight of command pressing down on him like the weight of the tanks pressing into the soft Norman earth. Around him, his men worked frantically, trying everything they could think of to free the stuck vehicles. They cut branches from the hedgerows and laid them under the tracks. They used wooden planks from a nearby farm. They tried winching, pushing, and at one point even attempted to use explosives to firm up the ground, but that only created more mud. As night fell on April 19th, the 21st Panzer Division's Company C remained stuck in the valley near Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. 7 tanks were now completely immobilized, mired in mud up to their hull plates. The others were showing varying degrees of sinking. The rain continued to fall. In his chateau office outside Caen, Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber was working on another set of maps when Major Richter stormed in, holding a radio message. "Did you prepare the maps for the Saint-Laurent area?" Richter demanded. Friedrich felt his stomach drop. "Yes, sir. Map set 47B. Why?" "Because an entire panzer company is stuck in the mud because your map shows the marsh in the wrong location. The tributary stream is marked south of the southern route, but apparently it's actually on both sides of the route." Friedrich's hands began to shake. "But I followed the aerial photographs. Show me the photographs." Friedrich pulled out the file, spreading the grainy images across his desk. Richter studied them for a moment, then looked at Friedrich's face, noting the cracked glasses for the first time. "When did your glasses break?" Richter asked, his voice dangerous. 2 weeks ago, sir, during the air raid. I requisitioned a replacement, but... And you continued to make maps? Maps that men's lives depend on? With broken glasses? Friedrich had no answer. The room seemed to spin around him. Richter's voice was cold. "As of now, you are relieved of cartographic duties. Report to the quartermaster for reassignment. Get out of my sight." But the damage was done. The maps had been distributed not just to Ernst's company, but to multiple units across the region. And as the Allied invasion grew closer, the error would have cascading consequences. Back in the valley, Ernst and his men worked through the night. They had managed to free 2 of the stuck tanks by completely unloading them, removing ammunition, fuel, and any non-essential equipment, then using every available vehicle to winch them out. But it had taken 8 hours to free 2 tanks, and they still had 5 stuck solid. Martin approached Ernst around midnight, his face haggard with exhaustion. "Sir, we need to make a decision. Do we continue trying to recover these tanks, or do we abandon them and get the mobile units to their positions? We're already 20 hours behind schedule." Ernst looked at the stuck vehicles, barely visible in the darkness. Each one represented not just expensive equipment, but also the crew that relied on it, the men who had trained on it, fought in it, survived in it. "We don't abandon our tanks," Ernst said firmly. "And we don't abandon our men. We keep working." But by dawn on April 20th, the situation had only worsened. The rain had continued all night, turning the entire valley into a quagmire. 2 more tanks had sunk to the point of immobilization, and the infantry, cold and wet and exhausted, were beginning to show signs of serious morale problems. Ernst made a decision that went against every fiber of his being. "Martin, take the 9 mobile tanks and half the infantry. Follow the road out of the valley to the north. Find a way to circle back and reach our designated positions. I'll stay here with a recovery crew and continue working to free the stuck vehicles." Martin started to protest, but Ernst cut him off. "That's an order. The division needs at least some of our strength in position. Go." As Martin's reduced column rumbled away, Ernst was left with 9 immobilized tanks and about 100 men. They worked throughout April 20th and 21st, making agonizingly slow progress. They managed to free 1 more tank, but another sank even deeper, its hull now completely buried in mud, only the turret visible above the surface. The men were reaching their breaking point. Obergefreiter Klaus Meyer, a loader from Hamburg who had celebrated his 20th birthday just 3 days before getting stuck, approached Ernst on the evening of April 21st. His uniform was caked with mud up to his chest, his hands were bleeding from rope burns, and his eyes showed the hollow exhaustion of someone who had pushed beyond his physical limits. Sir, permission to speak freely? Klaus asked, his voice hoarse. Ernst nodded, knowing what was coming. The men are asking why we're still here, why we're killing ourselves for machines that might never move again. Some are saying we should just blow them all up and march out on foot. Ernst looked at the young soldier, seeing in him the faces of all the men under his command. Klaus, do you know why we can't just walk away? No, sir. Because the moment we give up on these tanks, we're giving up on ourselves. We're admitting that we failed, that we made a mistake we can't fix. These tanks represent every decision we've made, every life we're responsible for. If we abandon them, we're saying those decisions, those lives, meant nothing. Klaus was quiet for a moment. But, sir, they're just machines. No, Ernst said firmly. They're more than that. They're the promise we made to fight, to protect each other, to complete our mission. The moment we break that promise, we lose something we can never get back. Klaus nodded slowly, though Ernst wasn't sure he understood. But the young soldier returned to work, and the others followed his example. The recovery efforts took on a desperate quality. The men worked in shifts around the clock, using every technique they could devise. They tried building wooden platforms under the tracks, using logs from a nearby forest. They attempted to drain the surrounding water by digging channels, which only resulted in more mud flowing onto the road. They even tried heating the ground with fires to dry it out, but the spring rain kept falling, undoing their work faster than they could complete it. Unteroffizier Paul Richter, a mechanic from Dresden, proved invaluable during these efforts. Paul was 40 years old, too old for frontline combat by normal standards, but his expertise with machinery had kept him in service. He understood tanks the way some men understand horses, sensing their moods, their limits, their possibilities. On the morning of April 22nd, Paul approached Ernst with an idea. Sir, we've been trying to pull the tanks out. What if we try pushing them forward instead? If we can get them moving even a few meters, we might reach firmer ground. Ernst considered this. The stuck tanks are blocking the road. If we push them forward, they'll just sink deeper in the turn. Not if we widen the turn first, Paul suggested. We have explosives. We could blast away part of the embankment, create a gentler curve. It's risky, but it might work. They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Paul supervised the placement of charges, using just enough explosive to move earth without cratering the road. Ernst watched, feeling the weight of another decision. If this failed, they would have wasted precious explosives and possibly made the situation worse. The explosives detonated with a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. Earth and stone flew into the air, and when the smoke cleared, a section of the embankment had collapsed, widening the road by about 3 meters. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. They hitched tow cables to the first stuck tank and attached them to 2 mobile tanks positioned on firmer ground. Engines roared as the recovery vehicle strained against the load. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, incredibly, the stuck tank began to move. It crept forward centimeter by centimeter, its tracks gradually finding purchase on the slightly firmer ground created by Paul's modified turn. The men cheered as the tank crawled onto solid road. It was the first real victory they had achieved in 3 days, and it gave them hope. But that hope was short-lived. On April 22nd, French resistance fighters attacked the stranded column. They didn't have weapons capable of destroying tanks, but they didn't need to. They ambushed the exposed recovery crews with small arms fire, killing 3 men and wounding 7 more before melting back into the countryside. Ernst realized that every hour they remained stuck made them more vulnerable. Among the dead was Klaus Meyer, the young loader who had questioned their mission just hours before. He had been shot while trying to attach a tow cable, dying instantly from a bullet to the head. Ernst found him lying in the mud, his eyes still open, his hands still gripping the heavy steel cable. Ernst knelt beside the body, feeling a wave of grief and rage wash over him. This boy had died not in glorious combat, not defending a strategic position, not even facing an enemy he could see. He had died in the mud, trying to recover a tank from a trap created by a cartographic error. Get him out of here, Ernst ordered quietly. Prepare him for burial with the others. The resistance attack changed everything. Ernst realized they couldn't stay exposed in the valley much longer. The local population now knew their position, their weakness. More attacks would come, and eventually they would lose not just tanks, but most of their men. That night, Ernst called his remaining officers together. Besides Paul, there was Lieutenant Heinrich Schmidt, who commanded the infantry, and Feldwebel Josef Wagner, who led the recovery crews. Gentlemen, we need to face reality, Ernst began. We've been here for 4 days, we've lost 3 men to enemy action, have 7 wounded, and we're no closer to recovering all the vehicles. I need your honest assessment. Can we get these remaining tanks out? Paul spoke first. Sir, the 3 deepest ones are beyond our capability. We would need specialized engineering equipment, heavy cranes, maybe even railway equipment. The other 3 we might manage with another week of work. A week we don't have, Heinrich added. The resistance knows we're here. They'll bring in more fighters, maybe even coordinate with Allied commandos. We're sitting ducks. Joseph nodded agreement. The men are exhausted, sir. They're ready to follow your orders, but they're at the end of their physical capacity. We're running low on food, fuel for the generators, medical supplies, everything. Ernst looked at each man in turn. Then we make a final decision. Tomorrow, we attempt one last major push to free the 3 recoverable tanks. We work through the entire day, using every resource we have left. Whatever we can't recover by nightfall, we destroy. Then we march out under cover of darkness. The officers agreed, though Ernst could see the defeat in their eyes. They had all hoped to save every vehicle, to prove that determination could overcome any obstacle. Now they were accepting what they should have accepted days earlier, that some battles cannot be won. He radioed headquarters again. We need engineering support, heavy equipment. We cannot recover these vehicles with what we have. The response was terse. No engineering units available. Make do with what you have or destroy the vehicles to prevent capture. Destroy them. The words cut through Ernst like a knife. These were his tanks, his responsibility. But he also knew that if the Allies invaded and found them stuck here, they would simply capture them intact. April 23rd began before dawn. The men worked with desperate intensity, knowing this was their final chance. They focused all their efforts on the 3 tanks that Paul believed could still be saved. The techniques they had learned over the past days were applied with precision, widening the turn, building platforms, using multiple tow vehicles and coordination. By mid-morning, they had freed 1 tank. The crew climbed back inside their vehicle with tears of relief streaming down their faces. Feldwebel Otto Becker, the tank commander, clasped Ernst's hand with such force it hurt. Thank you, sir. Thank you for not giving up on her. Ernst managed a tired smile. Take her back to the rally point. Get her serviced and ready for action. We're going to need every tank we have. The second tank proved more difficult. It was mired at an angle, its left track completely submerged in a pool of muddy water. Every time they tried to pull it straight, it shifted deeper into the soft ground. Paul came up with an increasingly risky solution. They would use explosive charges to blast away the mud around the track, then immediately pull while the ground was still disrupted. If we use too much explosive, we could damage the tank, Paul warned. If we use too little, we'll just make more mud. Do it, Ernst ordered. We're out of options. The blast sent a geyser of mud and water into the air, coating everyone nearby in filth. But when the debris settled, they could see the track partially exposed. They attached every available tow cable and pulled with 3 tanks simultaneously. The stuck Panzer IV groaned, shifted, and suddenly lurched forward, nearly colliding with one of the recovery vehicles. The men cheered again, but the celebration was muted. They all knew what came next. The 3rd recoverable tank resisted every effort. It sat in the deepest part of the mud, its weight having pressed it down until the hull was touching the ground beneath. No amount of pulling, pushing, or blasting could lift it free. By late afternoon, Paul approached Ernst with the news he had been dreading. Sir, it's no use. The suspension is damaged from the strain. Even if we could pull it out, it would never run again. The other 3 deep tanks are even worse. We need to accept it. Ernst stood in the rain, which had started falling again around noon, looking at the 6 tanks that would never leave this valley under their own power. He thought about the crews who had trained on these vehicles, who had named them, personalized them, lived in them. Tank 231 was called Brunhilde by her crew. Tank 247 bore the name Iron Gustav. Each had a personality, a history, a crew that loved it. He called the remaining crews together. About 70 men assembled in the rain, muddy, exhausted, demoralized. Ernst looked at their faces and knew he had to be honest with them. Men, we've done everything humanly possible to save these vehicles. You've worked without rest, without complaint, risking your lives every day we've been in this cursed valley. You should be proud of what you've accomplished. We've recovered 6 tanks that many said were lost. That's 6 crews who will fight again, 6 machines that will serve the fatherland. He paused, gathering his strength for what came next. But 6 tanks remain stuck. We cannot recover them. We cannot leave them for the enemy. At 1800 hours, we will demolish them. Each crew will be given the honor of preparing their own vehicle. Make it quick. Make it complete. We will not leave anything the Allies can use. The silence that followed was profound. Some men nodded, accepting the necessity. Others looked away, unable to face the reality of what they were about to do. Unteroffizier Werner Schultz, commander of Tank 231, Brunhilde, approached Ernst with tears streaming down his face. Sir, can I have a few minutes alone with her, before we place the charges? Ernst placed a hand on Werner's shoulder. Take all the time you need. Werner climbed into his tank one last time. Through the open hatch, Ernst could hear him talking softly, saying goodbye to the machine that had kept him alive through dozens of battles. It was a deeply personal moment, a soldier's final farewell to his steel companion. Over the next 2 hours, the demolition teams worked methodically. They placed charges in the engines to ensure they could never run again. They set explosives in the turret rings to warp them beyond repair. They packed ammunition storage areas with extra charges to ensure complete destruction. Each crew personalized their farewell. Some carved their names inside the turrets. Others left photographs or letters, knowing these would be destroyed but needing to leave some trace of their presence. At exactly 6 o'clock, Ernst gave the order, "All personnel, clear the blast area. Demolition teams, prepare for sequential detonation." The tanks exploded one by one, each blast a thunderclap that echoed across the valley. Ernst watched Tank 231 Brunhilde erupt in flames, her turret lifting slightly before crashing back down, twisted and broken. Tank 247 Iron Gustav exploded with such force that debris rained down hundreds of meters away. One by one, 6 tanks died, their pyres lighting up the darkening evening sky. Ernst felt each explosion like a physical blow. These weren't just machines being destroyed, they were symbols of failure, of decisions made and consequences born, of the gap between what should have been and what was. Each explosion was another piece of his command, his responsibility, his honor, going up in flames. When the last explosion faded, Werner Schultz stood beside Ernst, both men watching the burning wrecks. "Sir, how do we come back from this? How do we face the men who went ahead, who are already in position? How do we explain that we lost 6 tanks to mud?" Ernst had no good answer. "We tell them the truth, Werner. We made decisions based on the information we had. We fought against circumstances beyond our control. We did our best, and our best wasn't enough. That's all anyone can do." "Will that be enough, sir? Will headquarters accept that?" "I don't know," Ernst admitted, "but it's the truth, and it's all we have." They marched out that night, a bedraggled column of exhausted men and battered tanks. They left behind a valley filled with burned metal and lost hopes, a monument to how war rarely goes according to plan. Over the next 2 days, Ernst and his men worked with desperation born of pride and duty. They managed to free 2 more tanks, though both required such extensive repairs that they would be out of action for weeks. That left 6 tanks still stuck, including 3 that were so deeply mired that recovery was essentially impossible. On April 25th, Ernst made the hardest decision of his military career. He ordered the demolition of the 3 irrecoverable tanks. His men placed explosive charges in the engines, turrets, and ammunition storage. As each tank exploded, Ernst felt a piece of himself die with it. These weren't just machines, they were homes, fortresses, symbols of armored might. And he was destroying them because of a wrong line on a map. The remaining 3 stuck tanks took until April 28th to recover, by which point the invasion date was drawing near. Ernst's company, which had started with 22 tanks, now had only 16 operational vehicles. 6 tanks had been lost not to enemy action, but to mud and a cartographic error. When Ernst finally reached his assigned position overlooking the beaches at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer on April 29th, he was 2 weeks late. His men were exhausted, demoralized, and traumatized. Their tanks were in poor condition, having pushed themselves to the limits of mechanical endurance during the recovery operations. Martin met him at the assembly area, his face grave. "Sir, I need to tell you something. While we were stuck in that valley, 2 other companies tried to use the same route. One turned back after seeing our situation. The other tried to push through anyway. They lost 11 tanks. Ernst closed his eyes. The wrong map had claimed not just 6 tanks from his company, but 11 from another, 17 tanks total, along with their crews dead, wounded, or captured during recovery operations. An entire Panzer battalion's worth of strength lost before the battle had even begun. On June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion came. Ernst and his surviving tanks fought at Omaha Beach, exactly where they were supposed to have been 2 weeks earlier. But they were fewer in number, their crews exhausted, and their mechanical reliability compromised. They fought bravely, but they couldn't stop what was coming. The morning began with a naval bombardment unlike anything Ernst had ever experienced. He had survived the Russian front, had endured Katyusha, rocket barrages, and massive artillery strikes, but this was different. The Allied warships offshore fired shells the size of automobiles, each impact creating earthquakes that could be felt kilometers inland. Ernst's remaining tanks were positioned in defensive emplacements overlooking the beach. From his position, he could see the gray sea, rough with whitecaps, and emerging from the morning mist came the invasion fleet. Hundreds of ships, thousands of landing craft, an armada so vast it seemed to cover the entire horizon. "All units, hold fire until they reach the beach," Ernst commanded over the radio. "Conserve ammunition, pick your targets carefully." Beside him in the same emplacement was Werner Schultz, whose tank, Brunhilde, now lay as a burned wreck in the valley. Werner had been reassigned to Ernst's crew as a loader, replacing a man who had been wounded in the resistance attack. The 2 men waited in silence, watching the invasion unfold. The first landing craft hit the beach at 6:30 in the morning. Ramps dropped and American soldiers poured out, wading through chest-deep water under murderous fire from machine guns positioned along the bluffs. Ernst waited until the beach was crowded with men and vehicles before giving the order to fire. His gunner, Obergefreiter Hans Müller, had been with him since Kursk. Hans's first shot struck a landing craft still in the water, exploding it in a ball of flame. The second shot hit a Sherman tank that had just rolled off a landing craft, penetrating its thinner side armor and setting it ablaze. For 3 hours, Ernst's company fought with desperate intensity. They destroyed landing craft, disabled tanks, and fired high-explosive shells into concentrations of infantry. But for every target they destroyed, 10 more appeared. The Allies had committed overwhelming force to this invasion, and no amount of German defensive fire could stop the sheer weight of numbers coming ashore. Around 9 o'clock, Allied fighter bombers appeared overhead. Ernst watched as they dove on German positions, their bombs and rockets devastating defensive strongpoints that had held all morning. His own tank was hit by rocket fragments, damaging the radio antenna and killing one of his infantrymen who had been sheltering nearby. By noon, it was clear the battle was lost. Allied troops had breached the defensive line in multiple places. Sherman tanks were advancing inland, outflanking German positions that had seemed impregnable just hours earlier. Ernst received orders to withdraw to secondary positions, 5 kilometers inland. As his tank backed out of its emplacement, Ernst took one last look at the beach. It was covered with wreckage, burning vehicles, and bodies. But more landing craft kept coming, more tanks kept rolling ashore, more soldiers kept advancing. The invasion would not be stopped. During the withdrawal, Ernst's tank developed mechanical problems. The engine began overheating, a result of the punishing work it had done during the recovery operations in the valley. Paul Richter, now serving as Ernst's driver, kept the engine running through sheer expertise, but they were forced to stop every few kilometers to let it cool. "Sir, she's not going to last much longer," Paul reported. "The bearings are shot, probably from when we used her as a recovery vehicle. We're running on borrowed time." Ernst nodded grimly. Everything traced back to those days in the valley. The strain of recovery operations had damaged vehicles that might otherwise have performed perfectly. Crews were exhausted when they should have been rested. Morale was shattered when it should have been strong, all because of a wrong line on a map. Over the following weeks, Ernst's company fought a slow, grinding retreat through Normandy. They lost tanks not to enemy action, but to mechanical breakdowns that couldn't be repaired with the limited resources available. By July, only 8 tanks remained operational from the original 22. On July 18th, during fighting near Caen, Ernst's luck finally ran out. An American tank destroyer caught his Panzer IV from the side, penetrating the armor and setting the interior ablaze. Ernst managed to escape through the commander's hatch, but Werner Schultz and Hans Müller didn't make it out. They died in the flames, just meters from where Friedrich Weber's mapping office had been housed months earlier. Ernst was pulled from the burning tank by Paul Richter, who had already escaped. The 2 men lay in a ditch as American infantry advanced past them. They were too exhausted to run, too injured to fight. When American soldiers found them an hour later, Ernst felt not fear but relief. The war, for him, was finally over. Ernst survived the war. He was captured in July 1944 and spent 3 years in a prisoner of war camp in England. During those long years, he had plenty of time to think about the valley near Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, about the wrong line on a map, about the tanks that sank into the mud because someone had made a simple mistake. Friedrich Weber also survived. After being relieved of cartographic duties, he was assigned to a supply depot. He spent the rest of the war loading trucks, a menial job that gave him plenty of time to reflect on how a single wrong pencil stroke had changed the course of events. He never drew another map. After the war, Friedrich returned to teaching geography in Munich. He became obsessive about accuracy, checking every fact 3 times, verifying every source. His students sometimes complained that he was too demanding, too particular. He never told them why. In 1972, Friedrich received a letter from France. It was from Ernst Holzer, who had been searching for him for years. The letter was not angry or accusatory. Instead, Ernst wrote about the valley, about the stuck tanks, about the men lost. He wrote that he had spent decades trying to understand how such a mistake could happen, and that he had finally realized that war itself was the mistake, not any single error within it. The 2 men met in 1973, in Paris, at a cafe not far from a military museum. They were both in their 60s now, gray-haired and wrinkled, bearing the weight of their memories. They talked for hours, sharing their perspectives on those terrible days in April 1944. Friedrich apologized, his voice breaking. "I should have requested proper glasses. I should have double-checked. I should have—" Ernst interrupted him. "I should have scouted the route more thoroughly. I should have questioned the map. I should have turned back at the first sign of soft ground. We all should have done many things, but we were caught in something bigger than ourselves." They parted as something approaching friends. having found in each other not blame but understanding. The valley near Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer looks different today. The road has been paved and widened. The marshes have been drained for agriculture. French farmers work the fields where tanks once sank into the mud. Tourists drive past on their way to the D-Day beaches, never knowing what happened here. But if you know where to look, if you walk into the fields on either side of the road, you can still find traces. A piece of track half buried in the soil, a shard of armor plate, small fragments of a disaster caused by a simple error. The story of the wrongly drawn map teaches us something important about war and about life. The biggest disasters often come not from grand failures, but from small mistakes compounded by circumstance. A cracked lens, a grainy photograph, a tired man making a decision at 2 a.m. These tiny errors cascade through time and space, affecting hundreds of lives in ways that no one could have predicted. We like to think that war is decided by grand strategies and heroic actions. Sometimes it is, but just as often it's decided by wrong lines on maps, by miscommunications, by equipment failures, by exhaustion and human error. The men who fought and died don't usually get dramatic deaths and blaze of glory. Sometimes they just get stuck in the mud because someone drew a stream in the wrong place. Both Friedrich and Ernst carried their memories until their deaths. Friedrich in 1991 and Ernst in 1994. They never forgot the valley, the rain, the stuck tanks, the waste of it all. In their final years, they both expressed the same thought, that if their story could teach anyone anything, it was that the real enemy was never each other, but the system that put them in the valley in the first place. This is the story of how one wrongly drawn village map trapped an entire Panzer division. It's a story of human error, of the weight of responsibility, of how small mistakes can have enormous consequences. But most of all, it's a story about the men who lived through it, who carried the burden of those days, and who ultimately found not justice or revenge, but simply understanding,